One of the interesting things about Afghanistan, which pretty much all people in the world know, is that Afghanistan has lots of ethnic groups. It used to be that only anthropologists could tell you, well, there's Uzbeks, there's Tajiks, there's Imaks, there's Pashtuns, there's Hazaras. We could put that on an exam, and that would be a tricky question. Today, the average reader of an international paper is expected to know these things. We're familiar with the ethnic groups of Afghanistan. But one of the things that we're not familiar with, or we make assumptions about, is the dynamics of how ethnicity works in Afghanistan is different than other parts of the world. When the international community came into Afghanistan after 2001, they had recently dealt with the problem of Yugoslavia. And what happens in Yugoslavia? A unitary, multi-ethnic state, central power declines, and every ethnic group wants its own country. And eventually, they get their own countries. But one of the problems is it turns out that every minority that says we're oppressed and we want our own country, as soon as there's a country, we find there's another minority there, and they want their own country. And it is. So the view is that ethnicity is potentially very divisive, it's hard to deal with, ethnic conflicts are difficult, and that places that have a lot of ethnic groups are prone to fission. They're just going to collapse unless they have a very powerful center. So when the international community arrived in Afghanistan, it set about trying to make a very strong central government, structurally. I mean, not in practice, but the president, Karzai, he has a lot of power, and the Constitution is pretty much based on the Constitution that was written for the king in 1964, sort of a royal constitution. And the reason for this is, well, if we don't have a strong center in Kabul, the place will collapse. Because look, there are all these ethnic groups, and they've been fighting each other during the Civil War. But nobody really looked beyond that to say, well, these ethnic groups that are fighting each other, what are they looking for? What do they want? And the interesting thing is, whether it was in the Soviet war period, the Civil War period, the Taliban period, or even today, no ethnic politician in Afghanistan has ever demanded independence for his own people or for amalgamation with co-ethnics on the other side. There's Tajiks and Uzbeks in northern Afghanistan. No Afghan, Uzbek, or Tajik has ever said, why don't we create a greater Uzbekistan, a greater Tajikistan? And of course, the Uzbeks in Uzbekistan would be actually fearful of that. The last thing they want is having to deal with northern Afghans. But when we think about it, other ethnic politicians in other places, in Yugoslavia for years and years, there was push. We are Serbs, we are Croatians, we deserve our own state. Nobody in Afghanistan has ever said that. Indeed, the only time this has ever happened is with the Pashtun areas of the northwest frontier of Pakistan. As soon as Pakistan became independent, Afghanistan said, you have no right to rule over Pashtuns. There should be a separate Pashtunistan state. And that was very nationalistic. And if you looked at their maps, they drew maps of Pashtunistan that went all the way to the Indus River, like they ate up half of Pakistan. This made the Pakistani government very nervous. But if you looked or asked, the question was, well, do you want to create a state of all Pashtuns? Will it be part of Afghanistan? They were very unclear because actually they didn't want that. There are more Pashtuns in Pakistan than there are in Afghanistan. If there was a Pashtun nation, the Afghans would be the minority. So they weren't keen on that. What they were looking for was an independent Pashtun state carved out of Pakistan, but did not necessarily involve them. That's a very different kind of ethnic politics. And the other thing that we see in terms of people say, well, during the Civil War, you had Tajiks fighting Uzbeks, fighting Hazaras, fighting Pashtuns. But they found that the easiest way is to organize your allies on the basis of locality, my kinsmen, my co-ethnics. So they organized on the basis of ethnic groups. So you could say, yeah, this militia is largely Tajik. This militia is largely Pashtun. But if you ask, are you fighting in the name of the Tajiks? Are you fighting in the name of the Pashtuns or the Hazars? They were not. They were fighting in their own local interest, which meant at any given time, they could choose to divide from their co-ethnics and unite with their former enemies, or make a deal that had no basis on ethnicity. So one of the things that perhaps shouldn't have surprised us if we understand that Afghan ethnicity doesn't have this nationalist tinge to it, is how easy it was during the Bonn Accords for them to create a national government at the end of 2001. Look at Iraq. Could they ever get the Kurds, the Shias, and the Sunnis to agree on anything? No. But the Afghans sat down, they agreed, they even agreed to bring Karzai, who was a Pashtun, to be the leader of the country. Now, they had just thrown out the Taliban, the Northern Alliance. Why bring back a Pashtun? Because they understood that was part of the deal. So if we understand Afghan politics and ethnicity, I would say that in places like Yugoslavia or other places, sub-Saharan Africa, Rwanda, Burundi, people are, if they have a table, they're looking to cut it into pieces so that everybody has a part. The Afghans are not. The Afghans are like card players. They compete fiercely for every individual pot. But win or lose, the whole question is, there's always going to be another round in this game. Let's not divide the table up, because then the game will end. So we find a remarkably practical kind of politics, and we're looking for ethnic divisions that are going to divide people, make it impossible to come to a deal. And what we really don't understand is the Afghans consider a multi-ethnic state to be a natural state, not an imposed state. And the whole question is, what is my group's power within this particular state? And even if it's not good today, that may change tomorrow. So I'm playing for the long terms. And you don't necessarily have to like or love the people that you're dealing with, but you have to do business with them. This makes Afghanistan's politics remarkably practical at some level. And so when we look at ethnicity in Afghanistan, one of the things we have to see is that ethnicity varies from one part of the world to another, and depending upon what dynamic it takes, it can move a state to dissolution very easily, or in the Afghan case, it can actually create a framework in which people are confident to make deals because they know they have the backup of their own locality, their own ethnic group, so that even if they're not doing so well this time, there's always another round. History will always move itself forward at a different pace and provide new opportunities and outcomes. When I mentioned playing cards, I often compare the Afghans to poker players, although it's more of an American game, but the idea is the same. You're sitting around the table, you're competing for resources that are there. They're going to be winners and losers. And the Afghans have had a state, people say, well, it's an artificial state. But it's been an artificial state for more than 250 years. It was founded in the mid-18th century. And the boundaries that it has have been stable for at least the past 200 years. So we have to ask ourselves, what allows this to occur? Certainly not the power of the central government, certainly not coercion, and a lot of it has to do with, if you're a card player, there has to be a game to play. Solitaire is a game played by one person, but win or lose, you get nothing out of it. And when the Afghans look about ethnicity, they tend to think about it, nationalist ethnicity, if you want to think about it, is romantic. Your ethnic group needs a prestigious history. We are all in this together. We have a shared commonality, a heart that we all have it in together. And very often we find that poets and historians are leaders in these because they're creating the sort of ethnic heritage. The Afghans look upon this as practical. But they live in a land where almost all marriages are arranged. You may not like your spouse, but there's good reasons that you should be married. And perhaps you'll come to like or even love that person, but that's not the key element. And in Afghan politics, it's the same way. You may not like the people that you're dealing with, but you understand that Afghanistan lives in a very dangerous neighborhood. If you divide into small mini-states, you will be eaten by your neighbors. Also, if you're small mini-states, who's going to give you money? They understand that a state needs to be of a certain size, a certain importance, and it's very useful even for an ethnic politician. If you're in Herat and dealing with Iran, which is your next door neighbor, is to say, I'd love to help you out, but Kabul won't let me. It's a very good excuse. And so people begin to rely on the fact that even if they do not like other ethnic groups, that the composition of the state that they have is advantageous for everyone. And when they look around, they see the possibility of states that can fall apart. And they're not really willing to take that risk. It could fall apart, certainly, but only sort of in extremis. As long as there's money and power to hold it together, Afghan politicians are not interested in tearing the country apart. When we look at Afghanistan, and particularly focusing on ethnic groups, what we're really looking at is the dynamics of rural Afghanistan, which still composes 75, perhaps 80% of the population. So it's the majority of the population. But the impetus for change in Afghanistan has always come from its cities and its educated elite. The first push to modernize Afghanistan did not come from foreigners, but came in the 1920s when Afghanistan received its full independence from Britain after launching a small war against British India. And there, the Afghan emir really wanted to push the country forward. He failed, and there was a period of reaction. And so what we found is there's periods of progressive governments and then reaction, but that the progressive governments have always been led by an educated elite in Kabul. And despite their small numbers, these people have been remarkably influential. But one of the interesting questions that comes now over the past 10 years is that people who are interested in changing Afghanistan are probably now a much larger percentage of the country. One of the things that we forget is that the majority of Afghans were born after 1989, after the Soviets left. For them, the Soviet war is their grandfather's war. And even the Taliban are a very distant memory. Yes, they were ruling when they were children. So we have an enormous number of people who have a much greater interest in Afghanistan's future than they do in its past. And the whole question is, where do they want to take the country? With so many people now moving from the rural areas to the cities, one of the things we have to ask is, well, what's the cultural disposition, what's the political disposition of this new urban population? Is it simply rural people living in higher density populations, or with opportunities that are available? Is it a people that are looking to a different way? And one of the things that's really quite striking is communications. Before the war, the only telephone you would find in a rural, provincial Afghan setting was in the governor's palace. One phone. Now every Afghan has at least one cell phone. When I returned to visit the nomads that I hadn't seen for 20 years, and I said, well, here I am. They said, yeah, we heard you were coming. I said, how did you? Somebody called us from Virginia. They said to expect you in 3 days. This shows you how internationally people can be connected. If you want to know the price of the sheep, you don't have to walk 2 days to the bazaar to find out. You get on the phone and somebody will tell you. And then you decide whether it's worth coming in. And in Kabul today, there are no street signs. So when people are visiting, they always say, well, where are you living? Where are you living? And they get directions on the phone. And that's entirely new. The internet is also new. So you have a population that's really, interested in breaking Afghanistan into the wider world. That really wants to see peace. And one of the things that's only just begun to be realized is Afghanistan is, it's true, right now one of the poorest countries on earth. But intrinsically, it is not a poor country. It has some of the largest undeveloped mineral resources in the world. The Afghans have sold the rights for one copper mine to the Chinese for $3 billion. And the Chinese have said, we'll build a railway to take it out. The Indians have said, we will spend $12 billion to build an iron and steel complex in central Afghanistan. The Afghans have also noticed that they are the center of the inland Eurasian overland transport hub. So the whole question there might be, is Afghanistan about to move out of this old traditional sheep-raising, wheat-raising economy and into the modern world? And are we too focused on Afghanistan's past and not enough on its future potential?